am Karen Taylor. I am Program Director of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York, and I'm so pleased to welcome you all here this evening. This includes, of course, our in-person audience, but also our online audience. We have another special talk this evening, really, the restoration of Stanford White's dining room in Box Hill, The Perils of a Better Idea, with Samuel G. White, which is part of the Labor, Literature and Landmark Lecture Series for 2024. We host tonight's program in partnership with the New York Landmarks Conservancy and are delighted to welcome their members and the president of the Conservancy, Peg Breen, who is here also to introduce our speaker this evening. A reminder to mute your phones, and then I'm going to give you a little brief description of the General Society before I ask Peg to come up. For those of you who might be less familiar with the General Society, a brief introduction. The General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen was founded in 1785 by 22 artisans. Today, our 239-year-old organization continues to serve and improve the quality of life for the people of the City of New York through our various educational and cultural programs. These include our tuition-free Mechanics Institute, the General Society Library, of course, of which you are in tonight, and then just again to mention that we have a recently restored skylight, the John M. Mossman Locke Museum above, which you are welcome to visit at the conclusion of tonight's talk, and of course, our nearly 200-year-old lecture series, of which, of course, tonight is part of. It is now my huge pleasure to introduce to you Peg Breen.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure for the Landmarks Conservancy to partner with the library. It's now been, we've been counting it up, but at least almost 10 years probably that we've been partnering with them, and it's a great pleasure. It's also a personal pleasure for me to introduce tonight's speaker. Sam White is one of my favorite people. He's a friend and a longtime member of the Conservancy's advisory board. He's a founding partner of Platt, Byard, Dovell, White. For some reason, they want to be known these days as PBDW, which is much more awkward to say than just your names for some reason. He's known for inserting new interventions and flexible spaces into historic structures. Sam and his firm have won a lot of awards, including 5 of the Conservancy's Lucy G. Moses Preservation Awards. In fact, they're getting their 5th Lucy at our awards ceremony tomorrow night. Sam is also Sam is also instrumental in efforts to restore Gould Memorial Library, which is now at the Bronx Community College. The library is an incredible building that is considered Stanford White's masterwork. Unfortunately, it fell on hard times in recent years until Sam came along. And thanks to his rallying the troops, the City University of New York is getting a Moses Award tomorrow for restoring the gorgeous copper-domed roof of the library. So thank you, Sam. Sam has written 3 books about his great-grandfather and the firm of McKim, Mead White and their projects. He's a fellow of the AIA, a trustee of Greenwood Cemetery and the St. Gaudens Memorial, and a graduate of Harvard and the University of Pennsylvania. He's also super charming and wickedly funny. Please welcome Sam White.
Thank you for that introduction, Peg. I'm under orders not to be funny tonight, so just doing what I'm supposed to do. Anyway, thank you for that introduction, and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure for me to be here. Thank you very much for coming, and for the remote crowd, thank you very much for joining us. Well, when Stanford White was murdered in 1906, he was the most famous architect in America, really a result of the fact that he was a partner in McKim, Mead White, the largest and most famous architecture firm in the world. He led a flamboyant lifestyle that was avidly covered by the press, and he was 6'3" and had red hair, which is always a good thing for an architect. At any rate, in addition to this public life, Stanford White had another life with his family centered around his marriage to Bessie Springs Smith and their home in St. James, Long Island, Box Hill. You see them here in the garden, and that's a different Stanford White indeed. Box Hill, or St. James, is about 50 miles out of New York City on the North Shore. You can see it there. It overlooks Stony Brook Harbor, a very pretty body of water which feeds the Long Island Sound. Takes about an hour and 15 minutes, an hour and a half to get there on a good day. And the house itself is still extant. This was their house. It is owned today by my brother Daniel White and his wife Betsy. They are actually sitting in the dining room tonight watching this, so, but it's not interactive, so he can say nothing. It's a big house, as you can see. It covers about 15,000 square feet on 3 floors, plus another 2,000 square feet of porches. And houses of that era had a front of the house and back of the house component. And the back of the house, the kitchen, the pantry, the laundry room, the small dining room, the mudroom, et cetera, that's on the right-hand third of this plan, whereas the front of the house are those 4 rooms that I've circled here. And these are important rooms. I mean, they're the major public rooms in an important house, but they are what Stanford White did when he could do what he wanted. He wasn't answerable to a client in this case. And Stanford White had, I think, one of the most powerful imaginations of any designer in the history of American architecture. And what is extraordinary about these rooms is the finishes that he selected for them, starting with the porch in that corner. Now, 3 walls of the porch, the finish is the great outdoors. You overlook the garden and the harbor. But the 4th wall, I mean, this room, incidentally, is big enough for 4 separate conversation groups. And it's really an amazingly big outdoor room. But the 4th wall is the wall of the house, which Stanford White had covered with pebble dash, which he created by harvesting beach pebbles from the Long Island Sound beaches, pressing them into wet cement, and then putting larger pebbles around the windows and those concrete coins at the corners of the house. An exceptional material, and when the sun strikes it, it just comes to life in the most wonderful way. It also holds up remarkably well. This was put on in 1903, and it hasn't ever needed anything. Well, on the other side of this wall, I mean, just about 6 or 7 inches away, is this material. This is called Phragmites. Phragmites is a weed that grows in brackish water around the coastal areas, and Stanford White got mats of this material, and it must have cost about 3 cents a square foot, and he used it to cover the walls and ceiling of his living room. You see it here. The other thing that's remarkable about this room is the exposed steel beams. Stanford White wanted as much of a ceiling height as he could get, so he put the steel beams below the rest of the ceiling. He wanted a big room. They spanned from one side of the house to the other, but that's quite unusual. And then you have the Renaissance fireplace, but that is Phragmites, and just the most common imaginable material, except it was used in the 16th, 17th, 18th century for thatched roofs. Here's a picture from the mid-19th century of the harvesting of Phragmites, but nobody sort of thinks about it today, and probably they weren't thinking about thatched roofs in America then. But White took this material that was just so ordinary that nobody would even really think about it, and he treats it as if it is a precious material, paying a great deal of attention to the size and proportion of the panels, the direction of the grain, and then celebrating the sort of difference between panels with this double welt of bamboo. Just amazing sort of elevation of a material. In the next room, the front hall, sort of the major move is the great Baroque fireplace, and then the staircase, which is made by Guastavino and contains Guastavino tile. It's also Guastavino tile on the floor. He bought that tile for $50 from Raphael Guastavino, but the walls of this room are covered with split bamboo. And what's sort of wonderful about that is when the knuckle is opened up, it has that sort of figurative quality, almost like seabirds in flight. It gives this sort of movement to the walls. Again, another material that must have cost about 3 cents a square foot that is treated as a very fabulous covering indeed. Well, on the other side of this wall is a slightly more expensive material, a wall of Delft tile. And in the federal period and the federal revival period, people used Delft tile in really sort of modest homeopathic doses to sort of go around a fireplace or something like that. But what Stanford White did was to make an entire wall of Delft tile, which curiously is what they did in the 17th century in Holland. They used this stuff in abundance because it was relatively common. It's only now quite rare and expensive. But in the dining room, he created this Delft tile wall with no mantelpiece whatsoever. He just sort of pulls the Delft tile in for the fireplace and then returns it to the plane of the wall. The other materials here, in addition to that plaster medallion in the ceiling, is the wall covering called anaglypta. And this is paper. This is just wallpaper that has been pressed into a mold with glue so it holds its shape. And it's sort of the cheapest of the fancy wallpapers. I mean, you could get Spanish leather if you wanted to start to scale up. But he covers the walls with this amazingly ordinary material, which he has sort of cast into the shape of Georgian paneling. And I think the Georgian component comes from his partner, Charles McKim, who took photographs of, in this case, the Sabbatarians' meeting house in Newport, Rhode Island in the 1870s. McKim was really sort of enthused with Georgian paneling as a foreground element. I mean, he didn't need any decoration at all. But White loved the Georgian paneling, but he treated it as a background material. You see, he would hang his collection of faience on top of it. And what the Georgian paneling did was it gave the room a kind of subliminal structure, which is very typical in Stanford White. It's what he did in a lot of his designs, to put these walls that just seem to be sort of one material or one color, and when you look at them carefully, you discover that they have a whole hidden structure, which you start to feel rather than see. Well, here's a picture of a house that Stanford lived in his early married life in New York. This is the dining room, and you can see he sort of saturated the walls with his collection of faience. But what's interesting about the walls is that they're covered with mattress ticking. Again, he just went for this, the sort of the lines in the mattress ticking give the walls this sort of hidden structure that he liked so much. Well, there is Box Hill as seen from the air, and you can tell from this, first of all, that you regret you were not in the roofing business in the North Shore of Long Island. But then the second thing that might occur to you is that nobody in his right mind would design a house like this. And the facts are that nobody in his right mind ever did design a house like this. This house grew iteratively over a period of time. And that started with the marriage of Stanford White and Bessie Spring Smith in February 1884. And Bessie came from Smithtown, Long Island. She was a Smith, and she had 7 sisters or something like that. And she wanted to have a sort of a summer house that was near her sisters. And so they went and looked around, and they found this house, which was right across the street from her older sister, Nellie Butler. This is the most unprepossessing sort of mid-century farmer's cottage you can imagine, and they rented this for $800 a year. And this was home sweet home in the warmer months for them. They had a child, people started to come to visit them, and the house was clearly starting to get to be too small. And so if you look at the back of this house, you would think that a normal person would have just torn the house down. I mean, that is a complete mess. And but he didn't do that. And I don't know if he didn't do it because he couldn't afford to. It wasn't very expensive to build houses in those days. And or if he liked the idea of trying to turn what was genuinely a sow's ear into a silk purse. But he used the original house as a kind of a building block for coming up with his design for a larger house, and this is what he came up with. You can see the original house right there. He's doubled up that shape to create a double gable front. And so it's actually starting to have some character, and it's starting to define space in the front versus space in the back. That other house just sort of spun around with no particular front or back. But this is the house under construction, and this was the first of Stanford White's better ideas. The second of his better ideas can be seen if you look very carefully at this construction photograph. You will see that he took a pencil and drew lines suggesting the extension of the porch to go around to the back of the house. And that is what they built. And it was, the thing about these better ideas is that he was such a good architect. I mean, they look fantastic. And this just must have been about the prettiest house in this sort of colonial revival style in the North Shore of Long Island of this period. But the consequences of this better idea, I would say, were threefold. First of all, he had locked himself into the floor-to-floor height of the existing house by keeping it. Secondly, just about a year ago, we spent a significant amount of money rebuilding the very section of that porch that he had wanted to extend. I don't know what went on, but the pitch wasn't quite right when he extended it, and so it cost a lot of money to rebuild that portion. And then the third, more general criticism was leveled on the house by McKim. You see here McKim, Mead, and White taken around. This is around 1893, I would say, when this photograph was taken. But McKim always said that the old house poisoned the new one, which was a pretty harsh judgment. But I think that actually the old house is what makes the new one interesting. I mean, the conflict that Stanford White had to overcome is what makes this house, I think, distinctive. Well, about 13 years after he enlarged it, he went back and enlarged it again. He added a third gable, a hyphen, and a fourth gable, which is hidden behind the trees. He covered it was a clapboard house still up to that point. He covered the clapboard with, with wire lath, and then the beach pebbles pressed into wet cement, so that's where the pebble dash comes from. And then he enriched some of the cornices and the string courses there. And this was the house as Stanford White left it at the time of his death. And it's pretty much the house that is there now today. There is the original house in it, you can see. And he has this sort of iconic three-gable facade. On the back of the house, however, that iconic facade does not translate directly to the back. There's an offset. And so there is the original house sort of buried in this kind of this composition that he must have struggled mightily to try to get under control. They say what is it? Goethe said that architecture is frozen music, that the rear elevation of Box Hill is like a frozen Dave Brubeck composition. I mean, it just never stops, never comes to a halt. And this was what he came up with, and this is a drawing that he made of the back of the house. Now, White was working for himself. He didn't need sort of the niceties of fully formatted working drawings with title blocks, et cetera, et cetera. He was trying to get this house built in time to use it in the summer. The contractor had a very limited window in which to work. And so I think drawings like this were printed and shipped out to St. James, and the contractor was just building away, because every element in this drawing, with almost one or two decorative exceptions, was built in the house. But you can see that he's running the foundation straight across from left to right, and he's got the thing somewhat figured out, except for this area right here. This is the dining room, and Stanford White doesn't know what to do, which doesn't mean that the builder waited for him. The builder kept working, Stanford White kept thinking, and Stanford White came up with a better idea, and it was an amazing idea, which was this projecting bay, which with porches on either side of it, wraps around so that it really sort of anchors this restless elevation and becomes the focus of an elevation that otherwise just never seems to come to a halt. I thought it's really, and it also sort of combines sort of muscularity and delicacy in a really interesting way. So, I mean, bravo, Stanford White. Inside, you see dining room has windows practically on half of its walls. The bay window goes around on both sides quite deeply. There you see the medallion in the ceiling. There you see the anaglypta behind all the faience. And the windows over the window seat would drop down behind the back of the window seat. So in the summer, this was truly an outdoor room. It was also a white room. That was quite unusual for the period, where you think about those fancy houses in Newport where the room is some sort of strié or glaze or something with gold picking out at the details. This was all white, and it was unusual for the period. Well, this was the room in 1903, and in the following 120 years, this room has been heavily used for every kind of event. I mean, lunches, dinners, weddings, funerals, parties. Just, it's an amazing room because you have so much fun in this room that you kind of forget that the room is so slowly disintegrating around you. But it's a terrific room, and we've had a huge amount of fun in it. But this is where the story starts. And about two and a half years ago, we were renovating the back half of the house, the kitchen, the servants' dining room, the mudroom, the laundry room, the pantry. All those areas were really horrible. They hadn't been dealt with successfully in ever, and I don't think Stanford White ever walked into them. And so we had a contractor, Pete Malave, and Pete was looking for a place where he could set up a table saw. Now, because the kitchen was down for over a year, there was no point in operating the dining room, so that was down as well. And so you just push the furniture aside, and the dining room looked like it was a really good candidate for this famous table saw. And so there Pete is scoping out the area for a table saw, and he looks around and he points to the ceiling and he says, "What's that?" And what he's pointing to is an area where the plaster is kind of mushroomed. And one thing about Box Hill is when you were involved with Box Hill, you don't go looking for trouble. Trouble finds you. No. So I said to Pete, well, this room has always leaked, and so that's just a leak. That's what you're seeing is the leak. Plaster is mushrooming. Really, don't worry about it. Get your table saw in here and finish the kitchen. And Pete said, no, I really think that we should take a look at this. And so Pete said he wanted to do it, so I said, okay, Pete, knock yourself out. I mean, just go open it up. It's only plaster. We can patch it up. And so Pete opened it up, and I get a call from Pete. I'm in New York, and he says, Sam, you really got to get out here. There's something going on. And what he exposed was an 8x8 timber. This is a piece of 8x8 oak that is bent and cracked and split. And this is a serious piece of structure here. Something very, very bad is happening to the house. And he didn't know what it was. And I saw that and I knew exactly what it was. Because about 25 years ago, I was doing some research on Box Hill at Avery Library, where the Stanford White papers are. And I came across this drawing on yellow tracing paper labeled Truss Over Dining Room, Mr. S. White, St. James. And I looked at this and I thought, oh, so that's what that is. And I wasn't sort of concerned about the structural issues because I just sort of assumed that the structure was all fine. What really interested me about this truss, well, first of all, it's not a truss. If there are any engineers in the room, they would insist that it is not a truss because you don't get complete closure on all those diagonals. There are a lot of moment connections in this. They would call it most charitably a trussed beam, but it's 10 feet high and 25 feet long and holds up the whole second floor and more. But what interested me about it was this, I don't know if you can very faintly see on the left, there is this shape here. And when you were in Box Hill and you're walking down the hallway on the second floor, there's one point, you're going past bedrooms and bathrooms, there's one point when you walk through a very thick door opening, and I could never understand why that thick door opening was in the middle of the hall. Well, it was the truss that you were walking through, and that explained what was going on. So I thought, well, that's sort of interesting. And that truss, if you were to project it forward into the facade of the house, that would fall right about there. It kind of lines up pretty much with that thick pilaster in the bay window, and it's between two bathrooms, which you see there. But that's where the truss would be, and it goes back about 25 feet and rests on a chimney in the middle of the house. Well, diagrammatically, this is what's going on. You have the dining room downstairs. You then have this truss on the second floor between two bathrooms. You've got that opening for the hallway. And then the truss is supporting not only the second floor, but it's supporting the third floor and the roof. So it's supporting a lot. And the area that we had opened up was this area right there where the bay is projecting. And to go back to the drawing, you can see that there are a lot of things that are meeting there. And what's happening is that they are not quite meeting in the right way. And I will explain. You have the support of this truss from a column. The column, truss sits on a column at one end, it goes down, the column sits on a foundation. And so that's holding up the truss. But the load on the truss is coming down from the wall of the house. And so the load is missing the point of support by about 2.5 feet. And you can think that after 125 years of a house sitting on even an 8x8, you'd start to develop some problems. But what's sort of really interesting is that the contractor had installed a foundation right where the load was coming down, because he saw that drawing that I showed you earlier, and he assumed that that's what Stanford White was going to build. And so he ran the foundation just right under where the loads were, and Stanford White had this better idea, moved the load out, but never tweaked the design of the truss. Well, with that bit of insight, took us about half an hour to get call up the people who had these braces to support this truss, because this house was going to fall down. I mean, these things, what happens with these things is once they start to go faster. So we supported the house, and then you see various places in the ceiling and the walls where we opened it up, because at that point it's occurred to us that Stanford White might have taken a few other structural shortcuts as well, such as right behind that guy with the broom, he made a 6-foot wide opening that underneath a bearing wall in the house, but neglected to put a lintel in. So we'd always had trouble opening those doors. And then the hole in the ceiling we made because we expected the span of those 2x8s, 16 inches on center. No engineer could believe that the 2x8s would make that span and support what they were supporting. So we assumed that there was a second girder there, an intermediate girder. And so we opened it up to find the intermediate girder, and by God, there was none. I mean, those 2x8s were spanning away. And so anyway, we decided at this point that we better take the entire ceiling down and see what was going on. Which we did. Take off all the running trim, the crown mold, the medallion, everything came down, and we could see what was going on. And what you could see very, very clearly was what was going on with that 8x8. I mean, an 8x8, this was when an 8x8 was really 8 inches. And it's a huge piece of wood. I mean, you can't even lift it. But 125 years of a house sitting on it is what produced what you see right here. So the question then became, how are we going to deal with this? And so we had a couple of choices. The first choice was to put a piece of structure underneath it to support the entire bottom chord. There had been liberties taken with this bottom chord by one of the plumbers when the house was built, just drilled right through the bottom chord to run a 4-inch plumbing line through. And there were other things that had been done to this. And so this piece of structure would sort of solve all of those problems. And, it works in the living room. Somehow he gets away with it in the living room, but it wasn't going to work in the dining room. It just was not going to look that good. And so we rejected that. And then the second idea was to just deal with the load problem directly and put a column where the load is coming down and where the contractor had so thoughtfully put a foundation 125 years ago. And so the problem with that is that it meant that you would have had a column sort of going through the window seat, sort of sitting in the room. And then you had a choice as to whether you wanted to sort of acknowledge the unique structural condition of this particular truss, or whether you wanted to respect the symmetry of the room and have 2 columns. And so we didn't want any columns, and so we rejected that idea as well. And so I went to the engineers, and the engineer on this was Kristen Astos of Murray Engineering, and we got Ed Mead of Silman to agree to be the peer reviewer. I mean, there were a lot of people who were going to be looking at this project when we were through, and we couldn't afford to make a mistake. I mean, it had been done wrong the first time. We really couldn't do it wrong the second time. And so Chris and Ed came up with this scheme here. Everything you see in red is a new piece of steel. The contractors called this the hockey stick. And the hockey stick is 10 feet long. It weighs about 300 pounds. It's made out of half-inch steel, and there are two of them, one on each side of the truss. And by bolting it through the truss, it transfers the load, which is the red arrow, onto the column, which is the blue arrow. And then you can see that there are other bits of red here because there were lots of things, places where this truss really needed help. And so that was the plan. We sent it to a steel yard. They fabricated it. Pete called me up one day and said, the steel guys are coming this morning. I got out there by 10 o'clock and they had already put the damn thing in. I mean, I couldn't believe it. You know, I'd been awake in the middle of the night, just so sick with worry about what was happening to this house and how we were going to deal with it. And this thing went in like 2 hours. And there is the blade of the hockey stick going in. And I said to Ed Mead that, when it went in, I gave a huge sigh of relief. And Ed said yes, that he bet the house did too. And so, anyways, there it is. We had other pieces of steel to deal with. This is where the plumber had gone through the bottom cord. We had to reinforce that portion of the cord. We had to unbuckle the 2x8 joists and then reconnect them with steel plates, which meant that we had welder working in the house. We had a guy upstairs pumping water onto the site to keep the house from burning down, which would have been a bad idea. And so that gets done. We reinforce the structure of the floors. The engineers insisted that we double up the floor joists, and then we had to level out the existing ones because they had a huge belly in them. They'd been overstressed for so long. We tied the bay back to the house. The bay was moving away from the house. The column that the truss was sitting on was this sort of slender column that Stanford White wanted because he really wanted a sort of a thin wall there. He didn't want anybody to know that he was doing anything special to hold up this house. And the engineers insisted that we add another column, which you see on the right, which meant we'd have to we'd have to pack out that pier. And we packed out the other pier. This is where we did acknowledge the symmetry of the room. We insulated the room and added heaters. This was a summer house. They would be in this house from about June to maybe November at most. And so this room was not heated. It was not really heatable. And so we added insulation and heaters to sort of stretch out the period in which we could use it, and then put the sheetrock up. And now we're kind of ready for what is called the fun part, which is the finishes and the trim. And so we replaced we had saved the crown molds. We only had to replace about 5% of the crown mold that was lost in this operation. But in looking at the archival photos, we saw that there had one point been a beaded molding running around the ceiling, and that had gotten lost in the years that we'd had leaks and put sheetrock up on the ceiling and whatnot. And one of the contractors, Hank looked at Amazon, and he found this beaded molding on Amazon, and so he ordered it, and we were able to restore the beaded molding. I mean, this is teamwork on restoration, and so so we get that up, and that's great. And we have something, we're making progress. We cleaned the marble. The tile walls are framed in this white marble that I am convinced Stanford White salvaged from I think it was the A.T. Stewart House at 34th Street and Fifth Avenue, which was going down just at the moment when Stanford White was building this room. This dining room was in the second enlargement of the house, and his wife Bessie was a residuary legatee of the A.T. Stewart estate. So I think he felt as though he had a right to go and salvage some white marble. Anyway, there's a lot of little bits of white marble around. I think that's where they come from, but it cleaned up nice. You can see there. That object in the center, the fire back, comes from Versailles. Versailles has 1,250 fireplaces. I don't think they're missing one. Stanford White must have gotten this from a Parisian antique dealer, but it had been used for 120 years and was filled with crud. We did not think that the crud was part of the historic fabric or part of the history of this room, and so we had no compunction to getting out the steel brushes and cleaning it off. You can see, if you look at the right, this Apollo with the sunburst around him. That was used as the kind of the signature at Versailles for Louis XIV, and it's what inspired the medallion in the ceiling at Box Hill. The other thing about cleaning up that wall was that it showed you that Stanford White's wall of Delft tile wasn't just a wall of Delft tile. He'd done it again. He'd sort of using this very subtle differences in the tonality of the Delft tile itself. He created this amazing pattern of borders and fields that give you this sort of structure that, as I say, is felt rather than seen. It's very, very beautiful. And we found there had been some sconces in the room that we had sent out to remains lighting to be rewired and cleaned up, and they came back and we discovered that they were from Caldwell and they were silver plate. I mean, they had been black when we sent them out. They possibly were acquired by Stanford White's son. I'm not sure if Stanford White got these, or because I'm not sure about the schedule for electrification at Box Hill. But anyway, they were sort of fun to have, and we decided to put them on those two piers that we had fattened out to accommodate the column. There, my brother Daniel is holding one of them up to see what height we wanted in. And then there is the medallion. Remember the medallion of the ceiling? So this is what the original medallion looked like before we took the ceiling down. And you can see that it was badly damaged from water leaks in the room. And it also used to be sort of flush with the plane of the ceiling, but with, years of adding sheetrock to deal with this sort of leaking plaster made it was now starting to be slightly recessed. But we saved it, but we were not planning to reuse it. We just saved it for reference purposes. And we went to the Century Association, which is just right behind my back. And the Century Association, designed by Stanford White in the late 1880s, has a room on the third floor that has two of those medallions. And they were about 10% bigger than the ones at Box Hill. They were also used to support pendant light fixtures. So instead of having a mouth, they have this sort of plaster boss where a pendant would fit in. So we got permission from the Century to scan those, scan one of them, which we did. You see it here. We made a 3D, sort of 3D digital file of this, which was a lot of fun. You could sort of spin it around and look at it, and then made a 3D print, reducing it 10%. From that digital file. And we were all set to go cast this in plaster. And then we took a closer look at the 3D print. And we decided that the problem with this was that the face reminded everybody of a recent president of the United States. And there was no way we were going to put that on the ceiling of Box Hill. So it's back to the drawing boards for this one. So we take the original that we had saved and we put it in a box and we send it off to Hyde Park Moldings. There's Adrian Taylor supervising the unloading of it. There's Pete Malave, and we gave it to Hyde Park, and their sculptors sculpted us a new face for this. And just a kind of a wonky classical note. Apollo was supposed to be the serious one. Dionysius is the fun-loving one. Well, that face was actually rather Dionysian, but it was supposed to be Apollo. Well, we came up with a much more Apollonian face. This is a serious guy, because having dinner at Box Hill is a serious business. And so, so this was our face. We made a 3D mold of that. And then cast that in plaster. You see it on the skid there in the background. We prepared the ceiling for it, and then under Adrian's supervision, installed it into the ceiling. And now the room was, from an architectural perspective, complete, but there was still more to go. But it looks pretty good. But we're down to the big problem. When Stanford White was doing those other finishes, you have to admit that there's kind of an endless supply of beach pebbles, anaglypta, and bamboo in this world. But our beach pebbles, phragmites, and bamboo, but anaglypta not. Nobody makes anaglypta anymore. You can't get it. You could get it in the 19th century, but you cannot get it today. And we had taken the anaglypta down because it was, you'll see, it was in very bad shape. But we just had no idea what we were going to do to replace it. We talked to a lot of architects and decorators who specialized in restoration work, and nobody had a real suggestion for how to replace the anaglypta paper that had hung on this wall. It went right over that door to the pantry. This was the paper before the project started. And when you cover that wall with plates and you're having a lot of fun at dinner, as I say, you don't notice what condition the wall is in, but when you take the plates off and you're not having dinner anymore, you look at this and you realize that the truss was not the only problem that this room was having. This is an unheated room. It was 125 years old and it was unheated, and that's just paper, and the paper just cracked, and that was what we had. So we took it off, but before we took it off, we measured it up and created a set of drawings of the, and what that showed, it was quite interesting, is that even though this was this kind of the cheapest of the decorative wallpapers, Stanford White had had a custom run of it because it fit the wall top to bottom, left to right exactly, including changes in the height of the panels. He had this made for that room, and really amazing. So we started by, you do what you normally do. You Google anaglypta and see what comes up, and this is what comes up. I mean, this is basically various kinds of wallpaper in this sort of paneled pattern, and it had a couple of problems. It was the panels were a little small. They didn't vary vertically as the original did, but the biggest problem was that this was vinyl, particularly the one on the right, which I paid $400 to have flown over from England because I was really curious to see what it was like. My wife said that she would set the house on fire before she let us put vinyl in the dining room, and that seemed like there was a lot of sincerity in that remark, and so we decided we had to find another way to solve this problem, and we looked at various ways. We looked at abstracting the pattern in some way with wood. Didn't work. And then I remembered this material which called resin, which is actually called a syntactic polyurethane material that I had used in houses where you have a sort of fancy trim that suddenly runs along and then it goes up a curved staircase. And this stuff you can have cast in any profile you want. It can be very thin. It's quite stable. It's easy to work. And it looked like this was going to be the material that was going to solve our problems. And so I took the drawings that I had and I came up with this system, this sort of jigsaw puzzle system, a kit of parts for replicating the anaglypta on the walls, which was 3 different intersection pieces and then straight pieces. And this stopped the project for about 3.5 months. This took a long time to figure out and then to order and then to get. But it finally arrived, and there you see Hank, the carpenter, who was the beaded molding guy, putting the paneling up on the wall. The other carpenter is cutting the straight sections to size. Here is the wall to the pantry. You see it runs right over the pantry door, which is really kind of fun. So now we have recreated the pattern of the paneling, and then you prime it, and it's starting to look pretty convincing until you look more closely, and then you realize that you see all these cuts and joints and nail holes. And so you spend a lot of time spackling and sanding and sort of filling this thing together, and then you paint it again, and it starts to look pretty damn nice. And this is where we were. I think we had solved the problem at this point. Here is the finished wall. There it's going right over the door to the pantry, which is a lot of fun. Remember that this was always going to be a background material. So this is my sister-in-law holding up a plate. We're just seeing just what the general effect is. And then here is a comparison on the left of what we did after installation with the standing and running trim, with the anaglypta, with the plates, versus the 1903 archival photograph. And I have to say, I think we did a pretty good job of this. Well, at this point, we had solved the heaviest of the problems, and the rest was a kind of a romp downhill. The floor was beautiful floor, very, very wide boards. Nobody could ever tell what the species was. I mean, some people thought it was pine, some people thought it was chestnut, some people thought it was cypress. I think actually it was all 3. I think Stanford White mixed different species of wood because the grain, if you look quite closely, is so different from board to board. But everyone agreed that this floor was sort of starved and needed help. And so we got a floor guy to come and take a look at it, to work on it. And when a floor guy shows up at your house, the first thing he does is he takes his belt sander out of the back of his truck. And we told him to put it right back into his truck because this floor was not going to be sanded. I mean, the dents and scratches in this floor were really a part of the history of this room, and they were not going to be disappearing under a belt sander. And so the floor guy was a little puzzled, but he thought about it, and then he and his wife proceeded to scrub the entire floor with vinegar. And here they are, they've washed down the entire floor. They're now looking at some Dutchman to patch where we removed some floor outlets, and there you see 2 samples of tung oil. They really got into this floor. They loved this floor, and they did such a wonderful job with it. And then here is the floor after the tung oil. I mean, it's just stunningly beautiful. And now the room is now together, and we are now able to start putting things. We start to move the furniture back in. And remember, we're doing the back of the house. We're doing the kitchen, the pantry, I mean, huge amounts of stuff, the small dining room, this room. We had a lot of stuff, and I suppose we probably could have rented a barn, but what we did was we put it all in the living room. So that for about a year, the living room looked like a Renaissance garage sale. But it eventually, most of it came out in an orderly way. Some of it actually was banished up to the attic because there was truly too much of this stuff. But we got it out and we set up the dining room. And there is the dining room set up from the view looking towards the pantry and that double acting door. Here is the view of the Delft tile. That object in front of the fire back is called a crane. It's a sort of medieval forged iron piece that was used for cooking. You hung pots from those arms and swung them in and out of the closer or further away from the fire just to control the temperature. Stanford White loved them, and if you look at archival photographs of Stanford White rooms with great fireplaces, you'll almost always see one of those in there. He was sort of addicted to them, but so here is that all set up, looking pretty good. And here is the room set up for a lunch that we gave a couple of months after we finished the room, just to sort of celebrate the expense and effort of having worked on this room. And the expense and effort was really worth it because Box Hill it's a historic house, and this is an important room. But Box Hill is also more than that. Box Hill is a family house, and that family starts here. This is a picture of Stanford White's son, Larry. He had 1 child, and Stanford White's mother, and they both spent time in Box Hill. Obviously, Larry grew up there in the warmer months, but Larry would grow up and got married, and Larry had 8 children. It's a picture of Larry and his mother and his wife and his 8 children in this photograph. And then these children would continue to grow up. 5 of them got married, and they would have children. And in the early 1960s, Tony Furcell took this photograph for a Life magazine article of my grandmother, Laura, with her children and grandchildren. And so the numbers, this is the 60s. Since then, I mean, the people in this photograph, the kids have had children of their own, and they've had children. I mean, they're grandchildren now. But one of the children in this photograph, I think, probably in short pants, got married about 1.5 years ago, and he got married in Hawaii, and he wanted to have a big party after the fact. And Daniel and Betsy are extremely generous about letting family members use Box Hill for this kind of thing, because it is really a family house. And so they wanted to do it, and it was all set up. And you know, the project, probably as we were doing all that work in the kitchen and the dining room, well, that dining room project took 48 weeks. And on week 49, we had the party. It was really amazing. And this just shows, I mean, I'm related to only about 1/3 of the people in this photograph, and but which third, I'm not sure. And anyway, it's just, Box Hill just sort of comes to life when you have a lot of people in it. It's a house that was really designed for great parties like this. But there is one resident of Box Hill who actually prefers it when there's nobody there, and this is Daisy, who thinks that she owns the place. And so I will quit there, but say goodnight, Daisy.
Sam, thank you so much. That was tremendous. And I think it really meant so much more knowing it was your family house. Anyway, a wonderful presentation.
Well, you know, it's actually true. Box Hill, thank you. Box Hill is one of 2 houses designed by McKim, Mead White that's still occupied by the family for whom it was designed. The Galette's house in Newport is the other house. So it is quite rare in that respect.
It makes it really special. So I will say a few more words at the end, but in the meantime, we'll open the Q&A, and forgive me, I'm picking up my phone because I'm going to be taking questions from the online audience, but in the interim, we have a question from Peg.
Why was there a dead animal hanging from the ceiling in your great-grandfather's home in New York City?
The dead animal hanging from the ceiling.
That's what it looked like. It looked
In
like
New
a
York
dead
City?
cat. Yes.
Did we see a picture of New York City?
You showed the living room in New York City.
No, that's the living room in Box Hill.
Oh, well, then there was a dead animal.
No, that thing, yeah, okay.
Yes.
That thing is there's actually a name for that, and it's some sort of Italian piece of, some Italian medieval tchotchke. That it's like Saint Barbara or something like that, and it combines a figure with a fish tail and antlers. I mean, it's a apocryphal figure, but and I once read, but I've forgotten. If anybody does remember, please speak up. But there, it's not the only one. But you see them every once in a while in Italy. You will see one hanging from the ceiling. When my daughter got married in the living room in Box Hill, we were set up in the living room, and we had an aisle down the middle, seats on one side and the other side. She and I had to duck to get under it, but so I have a picture of us ducking, but I should probably learn what it is.
Hi, thank you for the talk. Jeff, I have a question. You mentioned the dirt on the fire back that you didn't think was part of history, and the scratches on the floor that you did. I'd love to just hear a little bit more about how you decide what is part of history and what's not, and how you, whether there's any gray area and tough decisions to make in the restoration process.
Caught. I mean, you. I think it's a judgment call. You know, a couple of years ago, I went out to see a McKim Mead White house in those houses in Montauk, you know, the Seven Sisters or whatever they're called, the association houses in Montauk, and one of them was owned by, the artist who does the plates, the broken plates, Julian Schnabel. And I had seen that house when it was owned by a woman named Hazanne Smith, and it was just a complete wreck. And then Julian Schnabel bought this house, and he fixed it up, and I went back to see it, and the screen door had been scratched by some dog for 50 years trying to get in, and he kept that. And I thought, this is amazing. I mean, this is part of the history of this house, and he kept it. I mean, he restored this house beautifully, but he said, this is important. So it's you know, you call it, it changes. You call it as you see it, but that was the thing that made, I think that was the one thing that sort of made me think that kind of desuetude can be an important part of the history. And I just don't think that, if anybody disagrees that the tar and the fire back should have been preserved. I mean, we'll make a bunch of fires and see if we can recreate it.
We have an online question. This is from Linda. In the dining room, with Daisy on the floor, is the slender high chair still being used? It's really precious looking and perfect in that particular spot. Do you know?
Yes, that is, I can go back to that. Over there, it's right there. That chair was designed by William A. Delano as a christening present from my grandfather, Larry. And it is beastly uncomfortable. But children love to sit in it. I mean, they really get a kick out of sitting in it, but you just wouldn't want to spend time in it. I mean, you can do a lot better for $12 at IKEA. And, but it's an amazing piece of furniture, and that is the history of it.
Right. Okay, I see a question over here. I'm coming. I'm behind you.
I'm interested in the pebble dash and how it was applied by hand. I know that it can be acquired in panels, and you see it a lot in England. But in those days, it must have been a labor of intensity to find the pebbles, have them be the right size, and to push them into wet cement. That must have been a tremendously difficult task.
Well, I can tell you that the pebble, you go to the beaches out there, the sound beaches and the pebbles, there's no shortage of pebbles. I mean, it just never, you're never gonna run out of pebbles there. So that part wasn't that hard. What he did was he stapled wire lath to the clapboard and then applied cement and pressed it in. I'm told that this was like an all hands on deck event. I mean, the family was there, you know, cousins were pressing pebbles into wet cement. And under certain light conditions, you can see what the Italian fresco artists would call the giornata, which is how far up they went in the course of a day, and then they stopped for the day and then went on the next day. So very slight joint. I mean, it's not even a joint, it's just the light catches it and you can see they would go up about 4 feet a day on this. But it's a miracle that it lasted, because if that house had had to be repainted, it would have been torn down years ago.
We have a question, another online question. This is from Tom Ryan. What type of foundation does the house have? Is there a cellar?
Terrible, bad foundations, I would say. I mean, so it's a combination of stone and brick, and I guess the newer, the 1903 foundations are brick. The 1850 foundations are stone. So it's a real mixed bag, and there's the cellar is this kind of labyrinthine combination of full height spaces and crawl spaces. It's really, you don't want to go down into the basement of Box Hill.
Okay. Okay, I see a question over here.
Thank you. I think the first time I went to visit the house, perhaps you took me back to a small library where you said your parents or your grandparents spent the winter because the house was so cold and uninsulated. So the question is, have you fully insulated the house now, or do you subject your brother to the same conditions?
We have not fully insulated the house. It's so the back of house spaces, the kitchen and the small dining room, are heated because they're right over the boiler, and so they're fairly warm, and you have storm windows. So, but you know, 2/3 of that house is closed down in the winter, really, and unused. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it just, you could never, and you couldn't insulate the house. You'd have to take the walls, take the walls down. I mean, you can't, I don't know if you can blow something in, but part of me thinks that the reason that the pebble dashes stayed on there is the house was not insulated. You know, funny things happen when you insulate a house. Suddenly you discover instead of having to repaint it every 10 years, you have to repaint it every 3 years. And so things happen with the way moisture is held by the wall. So don't touch.
We'll just take a few more questions. This is from online, this is from Corey. Might the lovely girandole mirror have once belonged to the Smith family?
The mirror?
Well, maybe I'm mispronouncing it. It's Girandole. Must be a prominent mirror.
There is in the other wall behind where this, right behind the photographer, where the photographer is standing, there is a sort of a early 19th century mirror with an eagle at the top. I mean, and that's actually a pretty good mirror. That was restored about 25 years ago. The Preservation Society of Newport was having a show, and we lent them that mirror, and they very nicely cleaned it up and restored it. So that may be the mirror that he's
right.
That he's
And well,
referring to.
I'm afraid I don't know if Corey will get back to us. So, but anyway, that was fascinating finding out about that mirror. Okay, there's a gentleman over here, and then I have a couple of online questions.
I can't help wondering what kind of building code issues you had to deal with.
I didn't hear that question. This is a repair. This is a repair. You don't need a building permit to repair.
what is the size of the property the house sits on now? And is it the same as it was originally?
No, originally the house was about 87 acres. It went all the way down to the harbor. Sort of a triangular piece of land that went from Moriches Road down to the harbor. My grandfather was an architect during the Depression, and he had these children who all went to college, and so to pay a tuition bill, he'd sell off a little bit of land to get them through college. And so now the house has about 13 acres, but then there are other properties, the barns and the other farmers' cottages and the dower house, et cetera, that were all part of the larger 87-acre estate. Those are owned by cousins of mine. And what's quite wonderful is that there are no fences or anything like that, so that the lawns and the paths just run from house to house, and they're sort of off behind trees or whatnot. So it gives the impression of being a vast piece of property, but it's 13 acres, which is not nothing.
Absolutely not. And it just sounds splendid. Now, this question I think you did partly answer, but I'll chip in as well. What species of wood is the floor? I think you said it was a mixture of things. But also, can I ask the vinegar? What does the vinegar do?
Well, I think it cleans off the wax for starters. The species, I mean, nobody ever could say for certainty what the species of the floor was. They were just, because you would look at the grain and you would see a piece and you would say, well, that's obviously pine. And then you would look at another piece and you say, well, that's obviously not pine. So that's why I think it was a collage.
Right. Well, unless we have one more question from the audience, okay, I'm going to take this last question and then this will conclude tonight's talk. But just for the online.
So you mentioned that wallpaper you found in England to replicate the paper pressed version of 1900s was $400 a roll.
No, $400 a roll.
$400 a roll. How did the final cost of what you opted for, which was so successful, compare?
I was so happy to find a solution to this problem.
It didn't matter.
It didn't matter, but it wasn't, but it wasn't outrageous. I mean, I think we paid, $12,000 for all to have the molds made and to have all those pieces cast or something like that. So it was within the context, it was a $300,000 project. So that within the context of that, it was perfectly tenable.
Well, Sam, I just want to express our huge appreciation to you once more for a truly fabulous lecture. Thank you so much.
Very much.
Yeah, and I just so really thank you. As I said before, it was fascinating to find out about the family house and how wonderful, how well spent those 48 weeks were. So thank you so much. And before we just round up, I just want to express our thanks to New York Landmarks Conservancy and indeed Peg Breen. Thank you so much for coming tonight.